right. Welcome to another deep dive with us. We always like to pick some really, well, thinkers who've had a big impact. And today we're going to get into, I think, a really fascinating one, someone who really kind of laid out a whole system, a framework for how we should even understand society and politics. And that is Immanuel Kant.
Yes, Kant.
So, I know you're the one with the deep philosophical expertise, but for our listeners out there, we've got a lot of folks who are, they really like to get into the nitty gritty, the logical consistency, the foundational principles behind things, and that's definitely what Kant was all about.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're into philosophy, Kant's someone you can't really avoid. He's got his fingers in so many pies, right? Like epistemology and metaphysics, ethics, and of course, social and political philosophy, which is what we're focusing on today.
Right. And we've got a great source for this deep dive, which is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on his social and political file.
The Stanford Encyclopedia, always a reliable guide, right? Very comprehensive, very scholarly, definitely a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those you could spend weeks just trying to get through it all.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to kind of pull out the really essential stuff, the core of what makes Kant tick, especially when it comes to those basic principles of how society should be organized, how the state should function, and all that.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Kant is that he was really trying to figure out how to justify, a just and fair society based on reason, right? So he wasn't just saying, oh, this is how things are, or this is how they've always been. He was really trying to say, okay, if we start from, some basic assumptions about human beings, about rationality, about freedom, what kind of political system follows from that?
Okay, so let's jump in. Maybe a good place to start is with this concept of freedom, which seems to be really, really central to everything he's doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, freedom is the cornerstone of Kant's whole system. His whole project is kind of geared towards understanding and advocating for what he calls enlightenment, right? And freedom is essential to that.
Yeah.
So he starts with this idea that every rational being has an innate right to freedom. But, it's not just any kind of freedom, right? It's not just, I can do whatever I want whenever I want. It's specifically about this idea of independence from being controlled by other people's arbitrary choices. So it's about being able to set your own ends, your own goals, make your own decisions without being subject to the will of others.
So, sometimes I hear people talk about, negative freedom and positive freedom. Is this kind of what he's getting at?
It's related, yeah. So negative freedom is often seen as the absence of external constraints, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like no one's physically stopping you from doing something. But positive freedom is more about having the actual capacity to act according to your own will, right? To actually have the power to choose and to pursue your goals.
Okay.
And Kant is definitely emphasizing that second kind of freedom, that positive freedom, that ability to actually act autonomously. But, and this is crucial, he also says that this right to freedom is always bounded by universal law.
Okay, so it's limited in the sense that your freedom can't infringe on the freedom of others.
Exactly. It's not a free-for-all. Your freedom ends where mine begins, kind of thing. And this is where the idea of universal law comes in.
Okay.
So for Kant, universal law is basically the set of principles that would allow everyone to be free at the same time. It's about finding a way to reconcile individual freedom with the freedom of everyone else.
Got it. So freedom is important, but it's got these limitations, these boundaries based on this idea of a universal law.
Right. And this is kind of what makes it tricky, right? Because you have to figure out, well, what is that universal law? How do we determine what those limits are?
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But just to be clear, so for Kant, we have this innate right to freedom, and that means that we also have a corresponding duty to do something, right? It's not just a passive thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So he says that we have a duty to enter into a civil condition.
Okay.
Which is, basically a society governed by laws.
Right.
And the reason for this is that in a state of nature where there are no laws, no government, no institutions, our freedom is actually very precarious.
Right.
because anyone could just come along and infringe on our rights, and there would be no way to protect ourselves.
So the state of nature is basically a free-for-all where the strongest or the most cunning, kind of rule.
Yeah, pretty much. It's a very Hobbesian view of the state of nature, very nasty, brutish, and short.
Right, right. Okay, so we have to leave the state of nature and enter into a civil condition. And this is where the state comes in, right?
Right. The state is the institution that creates and enforces the laws that allow us to live together in peace and freedom.
Okay.
And this is where Kant's really interesting, because he doesn't see the state as being opposed to freedom, right? Like some people might.
Right.
He actually sees the state as being essential for freedom.
Okay, so the state it's not necessarily this evil thing that's taking away our freedom, but actually, potentially, it could be the thing that's protecting our freedom from other people.
Exactly. Yeah, he has this famous phrase, hindering a hindrance to freedom,
Okay.
which means that sometimes the state has to use coercion, right? Like it has to, punish people who break the law or use force to prevent people from harming others. But the reason it does this is to protect the freedom of everyone else.
So it's like it's using force to create the conditions where freedom can actually flourish.
Right. It's like, you can't have a society where everyone's just doing whatever they want all the time, because then no one's actually free.
Right.
You need some kind of rule, some kind of structure to ensure that everyone's freedom is respected.
Okay. One thing that I find really interesting about Kant's view is when you think about what the state is supposed to do, he very explicitly rejects the idea that the state should be aiming at happiness.
Yes, that's a really important point.
It seems like a lot of political philosophy, kind of comes down to, well, how do we create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people?
Right.
But Kant's like, no, that's not the point.
Yeah, he's really against this idea of basing state power on promoting happiness. And there are a few reasons for this.
Okay.
First of all, he thinks that happiness is just too subjective, right? Like what makes one person happy might make another person miserable.
Right.
And so if you try to base the state on promoting happiness, you're going to end up with all these conflicts, right? Because people are just going to have different ideas about what happiness is.
Right.
And secondly, he thinks that focusing on happiness can actually be harmful to freedom.
Okay. How so?
Well, because if you think that the state's job is to make people happy, then that gives the state a lot of power to interfere in people's lives, right? To tell them what to do, what to believe, what to value.
Right, because the state kind of becomes the arbiter of happiness, and then they can sort of impose their own vision on everybody.
Exactly. And Kant's really worried about that, because he sees that as a real threat to individual autonomy.
Okay.
So instead of happiness, he says that the state should be focused on securing the conditions of right.
Okay, and right meaning?
Right, meaning the set of principles that allow everyone to be free at the same time.
Okay, so it's about creating the conditions for freedom, not necessarily about telling people what should make them happy.
Right. And this is where his famous universal principle of right comes in.
Okay.
Which basically says that an action is right if it can coexist with everyone else's freedom under a universal law. So it's not just about, not harming other people directly. It's about acting in a way that wouldn't undermine the very possibility of freedom for everyone. So you could imagine, like, if I were to, go around stealing people's stuff, that would obviously violate their freedom, right?
Right.
But even if I wasn't, directly stealing from anyone, if I were to, like, I don't know, spread a bunch of lies and propaganda that made it really hard for people to make informed decisions,
Right.
that would also be a way of undermining their freedom, even if I wasn't, directly forcing them to do anything.
So it's more about it's about the structure of our interactions and whether those interactions are compatible with this idea of freedom for all.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about creating a system where everyone has the opportunity to be free, even if they don't all make the same choices.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
One other distinction that I think is important to get out of the way here is this distinction that Kant makes between political freedom and transcendental freedom.
Ah, yes, the two kinds of freedom.
Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So political freedom is basically what we've been talking about so far, right? It's the freedom from being coerced by other people. It's about having the ability to act according to your own will in the social and political sphere.
Okay.
But transcendental freedom is a bit more metaphysical.
Okay.
It's about the freedom of the will itself.
Okay.
So the question here is, are we really free to choose our actions? Or are our actions determined by, prior causes, by our genes, by our upbringing, by all the forces that have shaped us?
Okay.
And Kant's view is that we do have transcendental freedom, that we do have this capacity to make choices that are not simply the product of prior causes.
Okay.
And he thinks that this is really important because without transcendental freedom, there's no point in talking about political freedom.
Right, because if our choices are already determined, then it doesn't really matter what kind of political system we have.
Right. We're just puppets on a string.
Right.
So Kant's argument is that because we are rational beings, because we have this capacity for reason, that implies that we also have this capacity for transcendental freedom.
Okay.
And that's why political freedom is so important, because it allows us to actually exercise that deeper freedom of the will.
Okay, so the two are connected. They're not totally separate things.
Right. Yeah, they're both necessary for a truly free society.
Okay. All right, so we've talked about freedom, which is foundational for Kant. Let's move on to some of the core principles of the state.
Okay.
So what are some of the key ideas that Kant lays out for how a state should be organized?
So in his work, Theory and Practice, Kant outlines 3 basic principles of the state.
Okay.
And these are freedom, equality, and independence.
Okay. Those sound pretty good.
They do, right. Very, very enlightening.
Yeah.
So let's unpack each of those a little bit.
Okay.
So first of all, freedom. Kant says that every member of the state has to be free as a human being.
Okay.
And what he means by this is that everyone has the right to pursue their own conception of happiness, right? As long as they don't interfere with the freedom of others to do the same.
Oh.
So again, it's this idea that the state shouldn't be in the business of telling people what to do with their lives as long as they're not harming anyone else.
Right. So the state's not supposed to impose a particular vision of the good life on people.
Exactly. It's not a theocracy, right?
Yeah.
Or even like a paternalistic state that's trying to nudge people towards, what it thinks is best for them.
Right.
Kant's really big on individual autonomy.
Okay, so that's freedom. What about equality?
Right. So the second principle is equality. And Kant says that every member of the state has to be equal as a subject.
Okay.
And what he means by this is that everyone is equal before the law. So everyone has the same rights, everyone is subject to the same laws, and everyone has the same access to legal remedies if their rights are violated.
Okay, so this is like a formal equality. It's not necessarily about everyone having the same amount of wealth or the same opportunities in life.
Right. Yeah, it's specifically about legal and political equality.
Okay.
So you could have a society with a lot of economic inequality, but as long as everyone is treated equally under the law, then that would still satisfy Kant's principle of equality.
Okay, that makes sense. And the third principle is independence.
Right. So the third principle is independence. And Kant says that every member of the state has to be independent as a citizen.
Okay.
And what he means by this is that everyone has to be a co-legislator.
A co-legislator. Okay.
Which means that they have to have a say in the laws that govern them.
Okay, so this is getting at the idea of democracy, right?
Yeah, it's related to democracy, but it's not quite the same thing as modern representative democracy.
Okay.
Because Kant didn't think that everyone was capable of being a co-legislator.
Okay, so he had some limits on who he thought should be able to participate in the political process.
Right. Yeah. So he excluded women, for example.
All right.
And he also excluded anyone who wasn't economically independent.
Okay.
So his idea was that to be a co-legislator, you had to be what he called one's own master.
Okay.
Which meant that you had to have your own property, or you had to have a skill or a trade that allowed you to support yourself without being dependent on anyone else.
Oh, yeah.
And his reasoning for this was that if you're dependent on someone else, then you're not really free. Right? Because they could use that dependence to influence your vote or to coerce you into voting a certain way.
Okay, so it's kind of a safeguard against undue influence.
Exactly. Yeah, he wanted to make sure that everyone who was voting was doing so freely and independently.
Okay, so these are the 3 basic principles of the state: freedom, equality, and independence.
Right.
And these are all, really important for Kant. But as you said, he didn't apply them universally.
Right. And this is where, Kant's philosophy gets a bit tricky, right? Because on the one hand, he's very committed to these universal principles.
Right.
But on the other hand, he doesn't always live up to them in his own thinking.
Yeah, he's a product of his time in some ways.
Right. And so, we have to be careful when we're reading Kant, right? We have to both appreciate the brilliance of his ideas, but also to be critical of the ways in which he sometimes falls short of his own ideals.
Yeah. I think that's a good point to keep in mind with any philosopher, really. Okay, so we've talked about freedom, we've talked about the basic principles of the state. Let's move on to the social contract.
Okay.
So this is a big one, right?
Yeah. The social contract is a really important concept in political philosophy, and Kant has a pretty interesting take on it.
Okay, so how does Kant approach the social contract?
So Kant actually approaches the social contract from two different perspectives.
Okay.
One is in his work on the doctrine of right, where he's really focused on the justification of property.
Okay.
And the other is in his work on theory and practice, where he's more focused on the limitations of sovereign power.
Okay, so two different angles on the same basic concept.
Right.
Let's start with the property angle.
Okay, so in the doctrine of right, Kant's argument is basically that private property is a necessary condition for freedom.
Right.
So his idea is that if we don't have private property, then we're constantly going to be competing with each other for resources.
Right.
And that's going to lead to conflict and to a lack of freedom.
So private property is a way of sort of dividing up the world so that we can each pursue our own ends without constantly bumping into each other.
Right. And it allows us to plan for the future, right? Because if I know that I have a right to this piece of land or to this house, then I can invest in it, I can improve it, I can make it my own.
Right.
But there's a problem, right? Because how do you justify private property in the first place?
Yeah, how do you go from everything being kind of up for grabs to saying, well, this is mine, and you can't touch it.
Right. And Kant's answer is that private property can only be justified through a social contract.
Okay.
So his idea is that we all agree to recognize each other's property rights as long as those rights are acquired in a way that's consistent with the universal principle of right.
Okay.
So it's not just a matter of, the first person to grab something gets to keep it.
Right.
It has to be acquired in a way that doesn't violate anyone else's freedom.
Okay, and that's when the state comes in, right?
Right. The state is the institution that enforces those property rights.
Okay.
So it's the state that makes sure that no one can just come along and take your stuff.
Right.
And that's what gives you the security to invest in your property, to improve it, and to make it your own.
Okay, so that's the property angle on the social contract.
Yeah.
What about the litigations of sovereign power angle?
Right. So in theory and practice, Kant's more concerned with making sure that the state doesn't become too powerful.
Okay.
So he's worried about the possibility of tyranny.
Right.
And his solution is to say that the sovereign power is always limited by the social contract.
Okay.
So even though the sovereign has the right to make laws and to enforce those laws,
Right.
those laws can't violate the basic rights of the people.
Okay.
And this is where Kant's idea of the original contract comes in.
Okay.
So the original contract is not a historical event, right? It's a kind of hypothetical agreement that we all make in order to enter into a civil condition.
Okay.
And the terms of this agreement are basically that we agree to give up some of our freedom in order to secure our other freedoms.
Okay. So it's a trade-off.
Right.
We give up some freedom in order to get the benefits of living in a society governed by laws.
Exactly. And Kant says that the sovereign power can never violate the terms of this original contract.
Okay.
So even though the sovereign might have the physical power to do whatever it wants, it doesn't have the moral right to do so.
Okay, so it's like a moral constraint on what the state can do.
Right. And this is really important for Kant because he sees the state as being a necessary evil.
Okay, why evil?
Well, because it involves coercion, right?
Right.
It involves the use of force.
Right.
And Kant's not a big fan of coercion.
Right.
But he recognizes that it's necessary in order to prevent even greater evils. So he wants to make sure that the state has enough power to do its job,
Right.
but not so much power that it becomes tyrannical.
Okay, so the social contract is a way of striking that balance.
Right, exactly.
Okay. One other point about Kant's view of the social contract that I think is worth mentioning is he makes a distinction between a right to revolution and a right to resistance.
Oh, yes, that's a crucial distinction.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So Kant is very clear that there's no right to revolution,
Okay.
meaning that the people don't have a right to overthrow the government, even if the government is unjust.
Okay, so even if the government is violating the terms of the social contract, the people can't just rise up and get rid of it.
Right. And the reason for this is that Kant thinks that a revolution would just lead to chaos and anarchy.
Okay.
And that would be even worse than having an unjust government.
Okay.
But he does say that there's a right to resistance.
Okay, so what's the difference?
So resistance is more like passive disobedience.
Okay.
So it's about refusing to obey unjust laws or refusing to cooperate with the government, but it's not about actually trying to overthrow the government.
Okay, so it's a more limited form of pushback against the state.
Right. And Kant thinks that this is justified because the people always have a right to defend their basic rights,
Okay.
even if they don't have a right to completely overthrow the government.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm.
All right, so we've talked about the social contract. Let's move on to Kant's views on different forms of government.
Okay.
So we've mentioned democracy a few times.
Right.
Was Kant a Democrat?
It's a bit complicated. So Kant was definitely a supporter of republicanism,
Okay.
but he had a very specific understanding of what republicanism meant.
Okay, so what did it mean for him?
So for Kant, a republic is basically a state where the power is divided between the different branches of government.
Okay, so this is like the separation of powers.
Right. So you have the legislative branch, which makes the laws, the executive branch, which enforces the laws, and the judicial branch, which interprets the laws.
Okay.
And Kant thinks that the separation of powers is really important because it prevents any one branch from becoming too powerful.
Okay.
And it also ensures that the laws are made in accordance with the general will of the people.
Okay, so how does democracy fit into this?
So Kant didn't think that direct democracy was a good idea.
Okay.
He thought that it was too easily swayed by the passions of the moment.
Okay.
And he also thought that it was impractical for large states.
Okay.
So he favored a system of representative democracy
Okay.
where the people elect representatives to make laws on their behalf.
Okay, so something kind of like what we have in many countries today.
Right. Yeah, although Kant's idea of representative democracy was still pretty limited.
Okay, how so?
Well, as we talked about earlier, he didn't think that everyone should have the right to vote.
Right.
So he only wanted people who were economically independent and who were, educated and rational to have a say in the government.
Okay, so it's a kind of limited form of democracy.
Right. Yeah, it's not full universal suffrage.
Okay.
But it's still a step in that direction.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to ask about Kant's views on government is his idea of the Enlightenment monarch.
Ah, yes, the enlightened monarch. So this is a bit of a tricky concept.
Okay.
Because Kant's not really a monarchist, right?
Right.
He thinks that republics are the best form of government.
Okay.
But he does say that if you have to have a monarchy,
Okay.
then the best kind of monarchy is an enlightened monarchy.
Okay. What does that mean?
So an enlightened monarch is a monarch who rules in accordance with the principles of reason.
Okay.
So they don't just, rule by decree. They consult with their advisors, they take into account the interests of the people, and they try to make laws that are just and fair.
Okay, so they're sort of like a benevolent dictator.
Yeah, kind of, although Kant would probably not like that term.
Right.
But yeah, it's the idea that even a monarch can rule in a way that's consistent with the principles of the Enlightenment.
Okay. All right, let's move on to another big topic, which is punishment.
Okay.
So Kant has a pretty famous theory of punishment.
He does.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Kant's theory of punishment is called retributivism.
Okay.
And the basic idea is that punishment is justified because criminals deserve to be punished.
Okay.
So it's not about, deterring crime or rehabilitating criminals.
Right.
It's purely about about justice,
Like,
about giving people what they deserve.
okay, so it's kind of like an eye for an eye.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very much that kind of idea.
Okay. Expert speaker.